sometimes it's helpful to take the time to fantasize. Now, when I say fantasize, I'm talking about what would you get if you had the money to buy whatever you wanted to make your audio sound better within some reason, but we're still fantasizing here, so we're not talking about a little bit of money. Let's say you had $100,000 to spend. It's a fantasy. I understand. A lot of people have a hard time living day to day. I get it. But that's not the point. The point is sometimes setting goals are helpful. And that fantasy of what you would do if, maybe it's if you got a hit song and it skyrocketed to the top of the charts and now you're in demand and what would you get? Or maybe you just win the lottery. Or maybe anything happens. Okay, so let's just say you got the money to do what you want to do. Now, what would you do? I like this as a concept. I used to know somebody who was a salesman and they used to put up, I love to cold call, and they used to stare at that on their computer screen as a screensaver every day. It might have helped them make more cold calls. I don't know. I know other people who used to put like a picture of a house, people who used to put like $20,000, just some number that meant something to them, that was their goal. So for us in audio, what we might do is we may say, if we had that kind of money, what would we do? Now, my perspective, all right, I love the idea of working in a console type workflow. I love the idea of when you're mixing, you must let it live and breathe as an instrument that you're playing. So you basically wind up riding certain things, riding some faders. There's nothing like riding faders to make things sound alive. It's much harder to do that when you're working on a mouse alone because you can only really move one thing at a time. You're basically one finger mixing instead of mixing with your both hands, and you're controlling the drums and the guitars and the bass all at the same time, and the vocals and how much backgrounds come up, and now all of a sudden you want more guitar. It's much more hands-on when you think about it in that way. That's why a lot of people like control surfaces. I own a UF8 and I use it less than I would think I would use it, but I still use it at the end of the song when I'm automating stuff. It's always getting used, right? But the way I use it is also different than a lot of people might use theirs. I automate more than one thing at a time. A lot of people will just ride like vocals, then they'll just ride guitars. I try to use it in a console sense where I'm using multiple hands on it at one time and using more, like basically all my buses get sent to the 8 channels, and then I can manipulate the groups as if I was in front of a console kind of experience. But what you're not getting is the analog voltage all being, when you do that kind of thing in the analog world, and all those different voltages combined to a wire on the master, and then that gets back into your computer after the compression and all, you're not really getting that. So I noticed that it does some of what I like, but not all of what I like. All right. So what I want to discuss is, if we were to go down the path of entertaining the idea of a console, there's consoles out there that are under $100,000, but there's not many. So it makes this conversation relatively easy to discuss. What I like about the console concept is the ability to EQ different channels and have it all at my fingertips, and the faders at my fingertips. And it's all sort of built into a workflow that's right in front of you. Now, a lot of people will tell you that today the thing that makes the most sense is to work by getting different gear and putting it around. You have your computer in the middle of your desk. Like the kind of desk I have has the 2 racks, and the center section is empty, so you can put a computer. I have my 5060 sitting on there, and this kind of makes it where my computer and everything is in front of me because I use that a lot, obviously, like we all do, and then the gear is to my left and right. That's a fine way to work, but in my vision of what would be the best way to work for me, I like the idea of a console. I like the idea of everything summing together and being all put together within this console. And then from there, it gets back into the DAW. Now, the reason that something like, so when we're thinking what's available in this price range, let's go back to that for a second. The thing that comes to mind the most for most people is like the Origin, the SSL Origin. Now, there's a reason it comes to mind. It's because SSL is one of the most commonly used consoles for mixing historically forever, all right? Now, the reason that that console started to become so popular and amazing was because the automation automation, they called it, or whatever, was created so that they could basically create different performances of the mix and then have them remembered and then be able to tweak parts of them and get new passes of just this part. But you'd have this amazing performance created using the automated faders to do everything. All right. So that was a big part of SSL's amazingness. That combined with the fact that you had a very flexible EQ that allowed you all the choices between the frequency spectrum, because you have these fully sweepable, filters. You couldn't, like, for example, on Neve 1073, you have choices. You have choices of which frequency. On an API 550A, you have choices. You don't have every frequency in between like you do on an SSL. So it becomes a thing of there's more flexibility. So when you combine the flexibility of the EQ with the fact that it had dynamics on every channel. Historically, SSLs, you got your compression, your gate, and your EQ on every channel, and automation. It's like, wow, lots of control at your fingertips, which is why you really don't have to go outside that. Now, you could have a rack of 1176s and LA2As and all sorts of stuff behind you. But you don't have to necessarily, because within the SSL, there's also the bus compressor. So that bus compressor is what is also giving you a big part of your sound and your glue and your amazingness. Now, the problem with buying consoles from the 90s, for example, that have this kind of stuff on them is, if that's the only way you can get it for under $100,000, there's usually, an older console, and it's something that might have been well taken care of, might not have been. The power consumption is crazy. Tons of power consumption on there. And there's ways to go around this. Like if you do enough research, you find some guys replaced all the light bulbs on there with LEDs, which are now a modern solution for more efficient, light. And because there's so many lights on that freaking thing that when you do that, you save a lot of power. So it's a thing people do who want to ease up on the power consumption a little. But those things required machine rooms to be able to house the power supplies. And, the SSL would the old school SSLs kick so much heat that you would need to constantly run your AC just so you weren't frying all the components within the freaking thing, or just yourself just dripping because it's so hot. So I'm saying there's like a lot to this, all right? In addition, some people would talk about you couldn't turn it off or on, but there's modern solutions for that. The reason for that I learned was that the way the original power supplies were designed for those things, the power would actually ramp up over the amount it was supposed to be and then back down. And in doing that, it would fry the modules a lot of times. So that's why people would talk about can't shut them off, can't turn them on. It was a flaw in the way the power supplies would work. Whereas they have modern options, people who are still using SSLs, there's enough of them where there's guys out there that made power supplies that do the opposite, where they ramp up the power to where it's supposed to be. Instead of above it and then get down, it actually ramps it up so it never blows anything. And that's why guys like TLA use those kind of power supplies, and they can turn the console on and off every time they use it. So it eliminated that need to keep it on all the time. And, when you combine this with some of those other power efficient ways of saving some power, you can bring your electricity bill down a little bit, but it ain't going to be the same as how efficient and how much less power it takes to run an SSL Origin. So there's benefits to stuff like that, an SSL Origin, but what you don't get is dynamics on every channel. The Origin is just the EQs. You don't get dynamics on every channel, all right? When you get an old piece of gear like that, there was flaws also in the routing, the way the switches were done. So if it wasn't recapped, reswitched, all this stuff, eventually some of those things might have issues. Now you can't route stuff where you thought you could. So it sounds like a grand idea to buy an old console, but only if you live in a place that's super populated with techs, like Manhattan or LA or Nashville. Outside of those places, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you yourself are a tech, or your best friend is a tech who is an investor and half owner of your studio. I mean, without the reliability of a tech, and a clone of that tech person, so in case he's not available, you've got the clone tech guy around. Like, unless you got that, I don't know, man. It's a risky play. At the very least, it's a risky play. Also, the reason people buy so many extra spare modules is because they know things are going to go down. They want to be able to pop it out and put in a new one and not lose their workflow. So they have extra modules. So it's more than just the console that you're buying. You got to buy all these extras just in case things happen. And you need the techs around. So that eliminates a lot of people's use for these things, because most people, I mean, there's tons of the world. And I mean, it doesn't live in these major cities with these SSL techs just lying around. So it becomes a thing, right? Me, myself, I'm not in one of those cities. So I'm thinking that's kind of out. It's almost out for me to get something on that old school level, because I don't have someone I could really rely on to be there all the time to figure it out. And maybe they can't figure it out. And maybe it's not something that's so easily fixable. And then what do? You don't want to wind up with a brick that costs 50, 60 grand. I mean, that's not ideal either. So what you wind up, and it's not a light brick, it's a boulder. That thing is big and heavy and everything else. So beyond all this stuff, right? Let's get past that. If you think about the Origin, and like, it's one of those things where, like, when I think about what I want, my biggest concern, is the fact that you can't automate the performances. All right, so let's start from the point of view of, once you start messing with EQs on the SSL, you're forced to print everything when you think the mix is close to done, or if you have to move to another song, you're forced to basically print everything that you've done with your EQ back into the computer. Now, you get the benefit of the SSL EQ. Again, you don't get dynamics on every channel unless you buy the 32 channels of 500 series dynamics, which is an option. Maybe you don't need all of them, but maybe you do. 32 channels of dynamics separately if you wanted dynamics on each channel. And when you're done making the mix, or you have no more time to work on that today, you got to go to another song. Now you print back into your DAW using as many channels as you have on the console back the other way. So let's say you've got, 32 channels of AD. So you fed the console with 32 channels of DA, digital to analog, to get the signal from Pro Tools into the console. Then you got to feed it back, A to D, into your computer and record it all. So that way you don't have to worry about what EQ moves you made. Okay, not such a terrible thing. And now, potentially, when you want to go back to mixing that song, you just send everything back at Unity and you can start working from there. Okay, like, I get that, right? I understand. But what I would say is, what you still have to do, in a way, is, like, always run another pass of the song and capture everything. Okay, that's not the worst thing. But then, you're going to reset you got to reset every single knob back to the 0 position, because it doesn't digitally recall itself, to start from scratch on all your EQs. So now you're basically starting over, but first you got to take the time to do that. If you're dealing with people on the top level, because we're fantasizing now. So let's say things go well and you wind up working with the people on the top level. I think it's really hard for anyone to swallow the idea that I made a great pass this one time, and then the next time, why does it sound different? Why does it sound a little different? Like, it sounds a little different, inside, because you didn't do the same pass that you did the first time. If it's a static mix where the faders don't move, that's fine. But if it's an automated pass, you didn't do the same thing. So now you have to buy this other thing, like the NG leveler by Wes Audio is an option, or the old Sigma, I think, will do it, but they don't make those anymore. So you have to buy one of those things to be able to capture automation, because I'm pretty sure there's another thing called, like, My Fader Port or Fader, something like that. And they make faders to turn them into automatable faders. And that's pretty cool, to take dummies and turn them into, automation faders. But I don't think they work on the Origin for some reason. I feel like there's some some design where they won't work in there. I'm not positive, but I haven't seen any Origins with those, so I could say that I'm not sure they work. You're making your fader moves. This Wes Audio NG leveler remembers it, and then it spits that back out again so that you can basically take that signal and run it through the bus compressor to get everything compressed together. Okay, I get it. It does sound like a lot of extra pieces of gear to tie things together that, you know, weren't built with all that in it. So in my experience, every time you try to tie a lot of things together, there's just more places for things to get messed up. There's, you know, it's a Dave Natal way of looking at it. The more patch points and the more different things you got to put together, the worse it is. So if you could help it, you know, streamline your workflow, it eliminates problems most of the time. So let's just think a little deeper on what other potential possibilities there are. That's not a bad one. I wouldn't say that's a bad one. I actually, you know, the Origin console is talked about a lot by, you know, TLA, CLA, and there's a few other people out there talking about it too, and they're saying it's great. So I'm not saying it's bad. It could be great. But that's just inherently what you got to deal with when you're working with something like that. Now, another option, okay, and this isn't, you know, for the same kind of money, because the SSL Origin, let's talk money. It's always important. 55 grand is what the list price is for the Origin now. If you were to get the 16 channel Origin, it's 36. So that's a big difference if you were to only get 16 channels. So something to think about, and not a bad deal. And there's really nothing else out there that gives you, you know, what that does for that money. But just keep in mind what you're not getting. You're not getting dynamics on each channel, which is a big one. You're not getting automatable faders, which is a big one. But in order to do that, you have to spend at least over $100,000. That's the point. Way more. So let's just go back to where we're at. Another option that I think is an interesting one is, and this is like if I was battling in my own head about which is preferable, the Origin or something else, there's something everyone should know about that exists, right? There's this JCF Audio is a company I talk about a lot. I talk about them a lot because I mentioned I bought the Latte and I love the Latte. It sounds so good, and it's important to me to acknowledge where there is brilliance, where there's a brilliant mind at work. It's important for people to know about that, and not a lot of people talk about JCF Audio. Mark Daniel Nelson has talked about it a lot. If I'm not mistaken, Al Schmidt used to use the Latte, so it's out there, right? But let me say this. JCF Audio has a product that's very, very interesting. He's making 500 series modules that are digitally recallable analog, and they are units that are very similar to the API 550A. They're made in the style of. I wouldn't call it, it's not the same thing. Like, that's not really what it's trying to be. JCF Audio, their motto is ruining audio less. He's making these 500 series modules that are digitally recallable analog, but in a way that's not being done at all. So what is it that's different? Let me explain. It's basically the controls within it are set up so that the EQ is like a 550A. The reason it's special is because with every piece of digitally recallable analog equipment, there's always a software component that goes with the hardware. Now, we all know at a certain amount of time, when a certain amount of time goes by, computers update their operating system. The software may not be still supported. It may not work with the new chips. Who knows what could happen? The company could possibly, some companies go out of business. And when that happens, they no longer update their drivers on their units and their everything, and now they don't work. So all of a sudden, if you have anything digitally recallable analog that's software component based, and you've got a software thing that's controlling the unit, you know that there's a shot that that thing turns into an analog brick at some point. Now, not brick in the sense that it doesn't work, but brick in the sense that it's the same as a piece of analog gear where the knobs work and none of the digitally recallable features work. So you wind up spending money for a piece that is digitally recallable analog, but you just get an analog piece whenever that happens. Now, I'm not what I would call a fatalist, but it's hard to ignore that. You know, especially when you're thinking in terms of buying a lot of it. It's hard to ignore that lots of software we've all had in the past, as soon as stuff updates a certain amount, we can't use. We can't just ignore that. That's a reality. And nowadays with computers, that happens more and more quickly all the time. So it always scares me, and that's why I don't own any digitally recallable analog stuff, for that reason, because I don't want a just analog piece. If I just wanted that, I'd buy a just analog piece of something I wanted. You know what I'm saying? It makes sense to acknowledge when there's a great, brilliant idea that has been created by somebody who makes great products, and his idea has nothing to do with software. The way he recalls the units, and there's a couple different ways to do it, but the one that makes the most like light bulb moment go in my head, where no matter what, this thing is always going to be usable, is this simplicity of this one design within it that allows you to recall everything in a digitally recallable analog way that has nothing to do with your computer, really. It has just to do with sound and the unit, and that's pretty cool. He's created a way to recall these things by simply spitting out a code from the unit that is basically sounds like a modem. It sounds like a whatever that sound is that happens with the modem. If anybody's been around AOL, America Online days, you know what I'm talking about. The fax machine sound, it does a thing, but it's quick. It's not it's a quick sound that you record into your DAW, and you put it on any track. And as soon as you play back that string of clicks and pops and whatever, these EQs that he's created automatically recall to wherever they were set at when you spit that code out. They go all at once, so you don't have to go one at a time. And if you happen to have a console's worth of them and you spit the code back from your computer, these things would go right back to whatever it was when you last had it set for whatever song you're doing. So that means you're working on a song, you're done, you think it's done, but you're not sure, you want to move to the next song, you're going to send it to the client, they may have revisions, whatever. You hit the button on the thing to make it spit the code out, you record that into your DAW, and then all you do, now you move to your next song. Whenever you want that to go back to where you are, to get back to the song, to make more revisions, you hit a button, the things hear the code. So you hit play in your DAW on that song. So all you do is open the song, hit play. These things hear the code and go back to where they were at that point. So now you have digitally recallable analog stuff that's completely independent of a software component. All you have to do is record that sound it makes, and then when they hear that sound again, they know what to do. How amazing is that? So what that basically means to me is, how can I use these? Like, the SSL Origin ain't cheap. So if you're going to spend 50-something thousand on a console, what would make more sense? Maybe it makes more sense to buy 32 of these things instead. Does that make sense? It's like, just we're fantasizing it again, right? I know these things are expensive, but let's talk. Does that make sense? Maybe 32 of those is is the same price as the console, roughly. So let's just determine what we're doing here. Like, then I would have the ability to recall every EQ setting, but what aren't I getting? I'm not getting, mic pre's, because they're not mic pre's, they're EQs. And I'm not getting, a fader for the output control, which you get on an SSL. You're not getting the meter bridge with the LEDs to the bouncing meter stuff to show you what's going on. You're not getting that. But you are getting, EQs that are digitally recallable analog, and you don't have to run each of these channels and print all your EQ settings every time you want to save what you've done on your EQs. So it saves that part of it, but no faders, no automation. So what could you do? You could use the SSL UF8 kind of thing to just automate faders in the DAW or whatever control surface you have. You could do that. But let's talk about what else might make sense. So this just got me down this path of, that's really interesting. And to me, that seems more futuristic or future, proof or future related or whatever you want to call it, more modern of a solution than the old school thing we've always done, which is make a bunch of tweaks on EQ. Now we we have to physically recall these every time, write all the things down, or print it back into the computer, and then it saves all the stuff for us because we printed it back. But we have to do that extra ADDA trip. So maybe the ADDA trip is okay and nobody cares and it's fine, but it would be cleaner to not do it. Let's just talk honest. It would be. And in addition of it being cleaner, you're sort of always now in a position where you can make tweaks and remember where stuff was at. You're not like adding EQ points and then having to subtract them if you want to tweak them later from the printed version. Some weird EQ, like addition subtraction version of changing EQs again and then reprinting. You know, I'm just saying, it sounds like a lot of, it could be a lot of ADDA. For people who aren't necessarily sure of all the moves they're making and how many tweaks clients will have and all this, which is a lot of us today because clients like tweaks and revisions, they like them. So that could happen. And then you're sort of in a position where you're printing and you got to take it out again, now make more changes and print again. And I don't know, it just seems like a lot of printing back and forth. I don't love it. So I like this idea of digitally recallable analog on the EQs. That's interesting. But keep in mind, you're getting API 55A style EQs. So you're not getting, you know, the flexibility of the analog of the SSL, which is basically those frequency points being completely sweepable. You know, you can get between all the frequencies instead of the selected points. But there's also a benefit to the selected points for some of us. Now, let me explain what I mean. All right. Some of us have a hard time making decisions, and the less we have to make, the less choices we have, the better. Some of us, you know, it's just built into our DNA. We will overthink and question our own decisions and keep trying to get things slightly this, slightly that. That's part of who we are, I think, when we go into this thing. Maybe it's all musicians, I don't know, but it's some of us, that muscle of the decision making being a difficult thing is even stronger than in other people. And, you know, the concept for me of having less choices, like whenever I pull up API style EQs, I'm actually happier quicker just because there's less options. So you've got the choices you've got and you make it work. And then that's what it is. So you keep it moving. There's something to that also, like there really is. And, you know, arguably the 550A is really, really good, especially for tracking. But if you're doing mixing, it's also used a lot. I mean, the 550A desks were used on a ton of records that had those in them, you know. So I'm saying it's, you know, how could you really go wrong? Either way, you really can't. It's just a different style of what you can do, and you have a little less choices. So a little less flexibility in what you're picking on your frequency points. That's absolutely true. But sometimes that's better for certain people because the less choices you have, the more quick you can move, and that is a benefit. So let's beyond that. Now I was thinking, man, it'd be great if these 550As had a fader on them. Wouldn't that be awesome? And then that's where I got into, okay, well, let me reconsider an option that I threw away before. You know, when you're thinking, like the API has a 16082, all right? The 16082 console is in the neighborhood. Let me see what that was. I looked it up before. I can't remember now. 51, yeah, so it's a little cheaper than the Origin being 55 and this one being 51 and change. So 51,000. Again, we're fantasizing. Don't go crazy, right? We got to have goals. That's what we're doing here. So the 51, you know, I mean, 51,000 for the API 16082, the Mark II version, which has, you know, newer automation in it. So check out what you get with this. With that, you get 16 slots for different EQs. So my thought was, interesting. You could put 16 of the JCF audio digitally recallable analog EQs in there. And then you would basically have fully recallable EQs that are very similar to the 560As they give you, except these can be recalled, so you never have to remember the settings, and you never have to print your EQ decisions into your computer and then have to get them back again and then have to maybe make tweaks. You never have to go back and forth with the ADDA. That's pretty cool. And you get fully automatable faders. So you're getting 16 faders that you can automate and basically create a performance of the mix that has vibe and personality and gives you a little more guitars here, a little more snare drums here, a little more vocal there. You do that nice breathing thing that you could do on the old school SSLs back in the day when the computers would work and things like that. Now you could do that. Again, it's only 16 faders, I understand, and the SSL Origin 32 is 32 faders. But price-wise, you are getting automation, and we haven't accounted for yet that this version here that I'm describing is unloaded with automation. So that means whatever those EQs cost, again, let's say we had that 100 to budget to play with, because that's why you sort of need a budget like that just to think about this stuff. But I'm not saying everyone needs that. What I'm saying is we have the fantasy, and that was our number because you can get a lot done with that number. So it's an easier thing to talk about. So you could potentially get this plus 16 of those EQs, and then also have the ability to choose between, there's an additional 8 slots on that unit to put things that will go on the bus processing. There's 4 buses that are stereo that you can basically put either compression or EQ or whatever you want, but on your buses. So you have basically, 24 slots to put stuff in, and you could fill them with whatever you want. You could fill them with 500 series from different companies. You could fill them with SSL if you want. Like, you could fill them with whatever kind of EQs you want. But I'm just loving the fact of the digitally recallable analog. So let's just say we did 16 of those, and then on the buses, you did 16 of some compressor of your choice. Doesn't matter, right? That's an option. And at the end of that, you'd still be under 100, but now you have automation and you have fully digitally recallable analog EQs. And, maybe the only thing you'd have to remember is how your compressors were set, unless, because let's just assume we buy analog compressors to put in there. So you'd have to worry about that. So that may be some settings to remember, but it's less. At least it's only 4 channels of something, because it's 4 stereo channels, so you're going to have them set the same or whatever. So at least there's that to think about. Only 4 channels to remember, let's say. Okay. Then you could always expand it later. See, that's the other thing that I think is interesting, is that the cool thing about the 1608 is that you can always add another bucket of 16 at any point. And you don't need to get it all up front. So that means, like, we could stay within budget and get a lot of what we want. Automation, fully digitally recallable analog EQs, compression, bus compression in this thing. And yet we'll still be under 100. And then if we wanted to spend more later because things were going so well, you could always do it. So to me, that's like interesting. That's actually might be a better, that sounds almost like a more realistic, modern approach to getting all this done rather than, the other way. Because if you think about it, with the SSL Origin, you still have to spend more money on dynamics if you want. So that's apples to apples. Right? I think there's something to be said for it. And when you do it that way in the 1608, you're getting what you would get in a console on the Origin anyway. Like, you're getting your ability to control different monitors, you're getting VU meters. I mean, you're getting a lot. You're getting your faders, and your faders happen to be now automated. So I think there's just not like one solution at all. It's just when you're starting to fantasize about this stuff, man, those are both options. If we're going to, that's it. They're both options. And I'm not sure of which is the better one, but I do know that if you love the work of using SSLs, which I do, I mean, I'm sitting here using a UC1 on every single mix I've made for years. This is a lifesaver. It saves me so much time because I have an SSL channel strip on everything, and now it's at the touch of my hand right here. So that thing is great. I wouldn't trade that thing for, much. That thing is amazing. But again, what else do I use? If you said, what's your second choice of EQ you pull up a lot? It's the API 550, either A or B. That's a big, I love, the B has an extra band, yes, but the API 550A has a great sound to it. And it's, like I said, less choices sometimes is better. And it does the job. It really does the job. So to me, it's like, either one of those is my second choice all the time. And if I just had those, would I be happy? Would I be happy mixing with just those? Probably. I probably would. And if I wasn't happy, would I be able to pull up, arguably the best emulation of what an SSL sounds like in a plugin using SSL's own version of their plugins, because I still have the UC one? Yeah, I would. I could use their, just like I'm happy with that now. It's probably, I could stay happy with that. And I have control, digitally recallable analog control when I do that. So essentially by adding the JCF audio, their version of the API 500 modules, I'm basically sitting here going, now everything's digitally recallable analog, but I also get 16 analog channels where I can feed I can get that analog voltage happening, sent through everything, going, and all I got to do is potentially just, if we're capping it at 100, I got to wait a little bit to get another 16, and then I'll have 32 channels. That's all. So, but it also allows you to try this whole thing out, make sure you're in love with it, and make sure you can visualize yourself working on another 16. Maybe you don't even need it. How many faders are you going to automate at one time? A lot of people, when they're really thinking about it, making a mix, maybe you'd put things down to buses and you don't need more than 16 to automate at one time. That's possible. Maybe, and maybe you get enough out of that. So it's just a lot to think about, but I can't help but talk about it because it's something I like to do. I like to really set goals, fantasize, and come up with ways to achieve different things for different, and I understand it might be out of everyone's reach. I get that. It's not the point. The point is, what would you do if you could? Because then if you start visualizing yourself as someone who can, maybe you will. Maybe something you do gets there. Maybe something you do really hits. And wouldn't it be nice if you put the thought into your own head first of what you would do with it if it did? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So let's leave it there. There's a lot we could talk about, and both of these things have different sounds. They really do. And, for better or worse, the Origin doesn't sound the same as the old SSL consoles, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just doesn't sound the same. It has a different sound to it. And a lot of the old desks, when there's stuff wrong with them, they become very unusable. So I'm not saying that the old desk is a better option. The new one's probably the best option if you're going to get an SSL. Getting something newer means you have less issues potentially to deal with, and they figured out how to eliminate a lot of the problems, like the switching with the routing and different things. They solved a lot of stuff. There's no machine room needed. It's a lot of good benefits to the Origin. These are both great options. The Origin gives you 32 channels. The other one gives you 16 at the moment for the same kind of price point we're talking roughly. So it's worth thinking about. Anyway, I'm curious what you guys think. There's tons of other options out there. I know the SSL makes an SSL XL desk that's, got 500 module slots you could put in there if you wanted to go the SSL route and have 500 modules. You could do that. So there's other options out there. I'm not saying there aren't, but on the level of the Origin 32, a comparable something in a close price range to that would be what I just described. Definitely. So anyway, hope that helps. Hope this, anybody who's out there thinking along these kind of lines, it's not a bad thing. Visualize yourself getting there. You might get there. I hope you dug it. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut. Leave questions, comments. I'm curious what you guys think, because a lot of us who've been doing this a long time, we think about this stuff all the time. We just never really share it. So I hope you guys dug it. You guys got this. Talk to you guys soon. Take it easy.